What do you mean this is a terrible class archetype? So what if I have a critical weakness to paper cuts? Ow! Today, we're going to take a look at the Warrior of Legend class archetype from War of Immortals on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello, travelers and tourists. My name is Mark, and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller that's glad to see the fighter is finally wearing light armor because it realizes it might need to run away for once. I mean, come on, we've been waiting for the fighter to suffer a little bit in this game. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today in particular, we're going to be taking a look at a little bit of a controversial option that was presented in War of Immortals. It is the class archetype known as the Warrior of Legend. The opening sentence introduces the narrative idea behind this class. It is said that the greatest heroes are often stalked by an implacable doom, the shadow cast by the light of their deeds. This is a class archetype for the fighter class, and it presents the idea of a character that is equipped to perform amazing deeds, but who at the same time is being stalked by their own inevitable demise. This fits alongside such classic mythological characters as Achilles, and can be used to portray characters that are intended to achieve great deeds, but who are definitely living on borrowed time. There has been a lot of controversy surrounding the Warrior of Legend class archetype, as essentially it gives a pretty major debuff to the fighter class, and not everybody agrees that what the Warrior of Legend gets in return is necessarily worth the trade-off. However, as you all know, I love a good narrative device in my games, so today I want to take a look at the Warrior of Legend class archetype. I want to talk about what it gives you, both the advantages and disadvantages. I want to talk about what kind of character this supports. And then I want to discuss whether or not this is a good addition to Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So come along with me for the legendary journey, and be sure to join in the conversation and let me know what you think of this archetype. Do you think that Paizo struck the right balance, or do you think that this is a poor addition to the game? Along the way, don't forget to do all the other YouTube stuff that helps to support the channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. All of those links will be in the video description down below. But with all of that out of the way, let's get started. We already introduced what the Warrior of Legend is, but I still want to read through the description a little bit, just to help us understand the narrative purpose of this class archetype before we discuss the actual mechanics of it, because I do think it's important in any discussion like this to know what Paizo is aiming for. So let's go ahead and read the description. It is said that the greatest heroes are often stalked by an implacable doom, the shadow cast by the light of their deeds. Such warriors of legend often garner great reputations for their prowess and ferocity in battle, spawning legends of their invincibility. These stories almost always end in tragedy, however, for the blessings that carry the warriors to victory are always accompanied by a terrible curse that all but ensures their heroic tales have grim endings. So that is the narrative framing that Paizo wants to give to this class. That's the story that this class is intended to tell. It's the idea of legendary, amazing warriors who do great things, but who ultimately suffer a terrible fate because of some kind of curse. I think it's good to have that narrative frame in place while we look at the Warrior of Legend class archetype, because it's very obvious that Paizo is going for a specific type of character, but I also think it's worth noting that I think a lot of the pushback from this archetype comes with the idea of the grim ending. Pathfinder 2nd Edition is a tabletop RPG, and like any other TTRPG, the baseline premise of this game is that you are playing a heroic character who's going to go off and do great things and have this amazing tale and win the day, hopefully, at the end. While I think it's pretty obvious the problems that come from the idea of trying to win a tabletop RPG, I would say for a lot of players, the idea of a grim ending, the idea of an implacable doom for their character I think it just kind of runs counter to the baseline idea of the game. The idea that your character is going to die or is very likely to die is something that not a lot of players bring to the table, and I think the very premise of the Warrior of Legend already sets this as a concept that only certain players and only certain tables are going to like. So as we're discussing the Warrior of Legend, I do think we want to keep the narrative purpose of this class archetype in mind, but I also think it's a good thing to say just at the outset that I think the narrative premise of the Warrior of Legend is not going to be a good fit for a lot of gaming tables, and I think you need to keep that in mind when you're looking at this class archetype. Going a little further, it notes, since the gods' reign scattered divine power across Golarion, more and more tales of such legendary warriors have sprung up all over the world. From Garoon to Tian Sha, Kazmaron to Arcadia, and across Avestan, all the way to the crown of the world, hallmarks of these stories include heroes and villains who prefer lighter armor, hafted weapons, and who all seem to have an aversion or vulnerability to certain types of opponents. And they give us a few examples that you might use as a storyteller. For example, they give us, the would-be ruler Gulric the Fierce slew a Lenorm in the depth of the Grungir forest, but was slain by the arrows of lowly bandits before he could claim a kingdom for himself. So that's kind of the narrative framing that Paizo's giving us. You have someone fierce enough to slay a dragon, who then tragically is cut down by simple bandits on his way to claim his treasure. This cursed weakness perhaps goes a long way to explaining why certain pieces of gear are so common to the figures at the center of these stories. With each warrior of legend living under the shadow of finding their doom at the hands of a particular threat, even such staunch stalwarts might prefer a weapon that gives them enough reach to assess their opponent before closing in for the kill, and armor light enough that it won't become a burden if flight becomes the better part of valor. Again, we have some narrative framing here, and again I want to talk about some of the assumptions that Paizo makes, because I see what Paizo was going for, but I also could see some problems before we even get into the mechanics. Paizo takes some of the famous stories like Achilles and explains away some of the common elements of the stories using this curse that supposedly stalks the warrior. This curse leads them to using certain types of gear that match with characters like Achilles, and their tendency to use polearms and light armor. Now, the polearm thing doesn't bother me too much, but this sentence right here at the end where it says armor light enough that it won't become a burden if flight becomes the better part of valor, I think this is another area where the assumptions of this class could be a bit problematic. I don't know if most players want to play a fighter who is interested in running away as an option. Again, I see the narrative that Paizo was aiming for, but I could also see where certain players just look at the narrative setup of the Warrior of Legend and say, I don't know if this is appealing to me. So I see some back and forth here, but now that we know what Paizo is aiming for, let's actually talk about the Warrior of Legend class archetype, what it gives you, what it does, and what effect it's going to have at the gaming table. So Warrior of Legend is going to kick in at first level, even though it is an archetype. So really quick, a class archetype is a special type of archetype in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, where the archetype is actually modifying a very specific class. So unlike normal archetypes that can be taken in conjunction with any class, a class archetype is always going to be tied to a specific class, and it's going to begin modifying that class at very first level. In this case, you'll note the prerequisite says you must be a fighter, so this is going to modify the fighter class. And because this is an archetype, it's going to come with an archetype dedication, which you must use for your second level fighter class feat. So there is actually a lot of cost associated with using a class archetype. You're locking yourself into a very specific class, you're locking yourself into very specific changes, and you're locking yourself into a very specific archetype dedication and some of the associated feats that you must take along with that dedication. Because you're using a class archetype, you're going to have to go at least so far into a class archetype before you actually qualify to use other archetypes in the game. So any class archetype that you're looking at has a lot of prerequisites and has a huge cost up front if you choose to play this character. We haven't seen a lot of class archetypes in Pathfinder 2e, and Warrior of Legend is definitely a dramatic example of one. Let's see what all it actually does. Warrior of Legend adjustments. You aren't trained in heavy armor. The Armor Expertise and Armor Mastery class features only improve your proficiency rank for light armor, medium armor, and unarmored defense. You don't gain shield block as a class feature. So already you're losing out on a couple of class features. You don't get heavy armor, you don't get shield block. However, we are about to get a positive. You are trained in both acrobatics and athletics rather than just one or the other. So that's nice, you're going to get an extra skill training. Then, choose one physical damage type which becomes your cursed weakness: bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing. You gain weakness to this damage type equal to half your level, minimum 1. So, at the very start of the game, you're losing access to heavy armor and shield block. Both of those are defensive class features, and you're choosing a very specific physical weakness for your character. This is going to have a net effect of seriously decreasing your character's overall survivability, especially at lower levels where physical damage types are very common. I actually think when you get to higher levels, where energy damage types are a lot more common, I think that this disadvantage actually becomes less serious as you level up, but at low levels this is pretty heavy. The next effect says, you gain Die Hard as a bonus feat, but you become doomed 2 whenever you take damage from your cursed weakness, unless your doomed value is already higher. Die Hard says that your character dies at dying 5 rather than dying 4, so that's a positive. But if you take damage from your cursed weakness, you gain doomed 2, which actually means you die quicker than a normal character would. So this is a little bit of a trade-off that's going to be kind of hard to balance. In some fights, you're harder to kill, and in some fights, you're easier to kill. Finally, your fighter weapon mastery and weapon legend class features grant you increased proficiency in both spears and polearms, but you can't choose any other weapon group with these class features. So the final effect of Warrior of Legend kind of turns you into a gunslinger, but only for spears and polearms. One of the great benefits of the fighter class is legendary proficiency, and fighter was the only class that could take legendary proficiency wherever it wanted. Later, Pathfinder 2e added the gunslinger and gave the gunslinger legendary proficiency, but said that that proficiency was limited to a very specific group of weapons. So essentially, Warrior of Legend here is kind of giving the gunslinger treatment to the fighter, saying, yes, you're going to be a legend, but it has to be in these specific weapons. So just taking a look at Warrior of Legend, the base package at level 1, the level 1 Warrior of Legend is explicitly and clearly, in my opinion, worse than the baseline fighter. I don't think it's necessarily so bad that it is unplayable, and I don't necessarily think that it's so bad that you shouldn't consider the character, but if you're looking at the baseline fighter and the Warrior of Legend side by side, the Warrior of Legend is weaker in almost every way. You essentially have one extra trained skill in the Die Hard feat, but the Die Hard feat is only applicable if you're not up against certain damage types, and at low levels, it's essentially a 1 in 3 odds that a fight is going to feature that damage type. At low levels, the Warrior of Legend kind of hurts. And I can definitely see why a lot of people have looked at the Warrior of Legend and said, I'm not interested. If you take the baseline cursed character that the Warrior of Legend is supposed to represent, that already kind of puts his class archetype on the back foot, and then you go in and look and say, this class is notably weaker than the basic version of the class, I could see why a lot of people are hesitant about this, but I will say I don't think the Warrior of Legend is unplayable. The penalties hurt here, and you are locking yourself into a very specific playstyle, but assuming you like the narrative and assuming that the playstyle fits with what you want to do, I could still see a player saying that this fits with what they want to try to accomplish with their character. I don't think Warrior of Legend just rules out the class archetype. It starts off on a pretty bad foot, but let's dive into what the archetype offers and see if it makes up for lost ground. So up first, we're going to have the Warrior of Legend dedication. This is an archetype in class feat, and as we noted, you must take this dedication with your second level class feat. This is actually an interesting nuance of a class archetype. If you have a first level class feat like the fighter does, you can pick a normal first level class feat just like any other fighter would be able to do, but when you get to second level, you must take the dedication. So you are being locked into this particular choice. You have been given a powerful blessing of battle that is also your cursed doom. As long as you aren't wearing heavy armor or wielding a shield, spears and polearms that you wield gain the parry trait. If the weapon already has the parry trait, increase the bonus when parrying to +2. In addition, you deal an additional amount of damage equal to your doomed value with weapons in the spear and polearm group. This damage is the same type as the required weapon. Okay, so we're starting to get some benefits. We're starting to offset some of the penalties that we have. First up, any spear or polearm that we wield is going to have the parry trait. This allows you to spend an action to raise your armor class. Not a bad option. If you are using a spear or polearm that has the parry trait already, you increase the bonus to +2. That's a pretty solid bonus. So essentially what they're allowing you to do is use your spear or polearm to offset the fact that you're not using a shield. This is not bad, but it's also not anything extra than what you would have if you had a shield. And actually, since you don't have the shield block reaction, it's still technically a little bit weaker. But I don't think anyone's going to complain about this effect. Being able to raise your AC is a good thing, and I do think this fits in with the general fantasy of the combat style that you're going for with the style of character, so no problem with that. The second benefit of this feat is additional damage that you deal with your weapons equal to your current doomed value. Now, mechanically, this is pretty minor. If you have a doomed value, you add the doomed value to the damage of your spear or polearm. As a martial character, you're certainly going to appreciate this. As a fighter with the best proficiency progression in the game, you just made your critical hits a little bit more intense. Not a problem. However, even in the, dare I use this phrase, best case scenario, where you have doomed 4, you're still only adding a maximum bonus of +4 damage, which doesn't even really compare to what the barbarian is adding when they rage. So at the end of the day, I don't know that this damage is particularly significant, and I don't know if this particular dedication feat is going to fully offset all of the problems that we inherited when we started this class archetype. Again, I like the idea of parry bonuses with my polearms, and again, bonus damage with my weapons. Never going to complain about that. These are useful benefits. I just don't know if this class archetype has yet scaled to the penalties we took when we started this character. However, I do want to pause here and note something important, because this is where Paizo is introducing an important thematic element to this class archetype. Notice you get bonus damage equal to your doomed value. This is a big part of what the Warrior of Legend is going for. You are attempting to take that curse that your character bears and turn it against your enemies. The Warrior of Legend is a class archetype that wants to be doomed because they can use their doomed value offensively. Now, as we go further along in this conversation, I don't know if you're going to be sold that this is a good thing or not. There's obviously a lot of risk to the reward, and whether or not Paizo struck the right mechanical balance, I can see why opinions would land on both sides, but for a second I just want to focus in on what Paizo is doing narratively here. Your character knows they are doomed, but they're using that knowledge to enhance their own abilities and enhance their options inside of a fight. I will say, I appreciate Paizo trying to develop this. This is a very interesting space. Whether or not you think Paizo succeeded, I think it's cool that Paizo tried, and at the very least, I love the fact that Paizo attempted this. How can you make a doomed character more effective as a result of their curse? That is interesting storytelling, and that is something that I'm happy to explore. Now, the Warrior of Legend dedication is the only archetype feat that you have to take. All of the other feats from this point are entirely optional. But if you ever want to pick up an archetype that's not Warrior of Legend, you've got to do at least 2 more of these. So odds are you're probably going to be taking at least a few of these. So let's see what the Warrior of Legend presents and how we can dig a little deeper into these concepts. First up, we have Heroic Defiance. This is a 4th level feat. It's a reaction with a frequency of once every 10 minutes, and it has the trigger, you gain the doomed condition. Again, remember, this is a class archetype that wants you to be doomed, so theoretically this is something that should come up pretty regularly. It reads, even as the shadows of your doom haunt the corners of your vision, your implacable spirit surges and cries out that your time has not yet come. You gain temporary hit points equal to your level and a +1 status bonus on all saving throws, both of which last for 1 minute. So, this is a pretty fun reaction. When you would gain the doomed condition, you gain temporary hit points and a bonus on saving throws. This isn't going to necessarily overpower your character, but a defensive reaction like this is pretty solid. And honestly, I feel like Heroic Defiance is a pretty solid replacement for the loss of Shield Block. If you think about what Shield Block is intended to do for a character and how often it's intended to be used, Heroic Defiance kind of fits in the exact same niche. You can't use it quite as often as Shield Block can be used, but it's also a little bit stronger because you're getting a status bonus on saving throws. So I actually think that Heroic Defiance is just a really solid replacement for the loss of Shield Block. And unlike Shield Block, you don't necessarily have to raise a shield first, meaning that the action economy is a little bit better here. Again, it's not a perfect 1-for-1, but this is actually, I think, a pretty good replacement for something that you lost, so I do like Heroic Defiance. Next up, we have the 8th level feat, Piercing Doom, and the requirements are that your character is doomed 2 or greater. Seeing as doomed 2 is kind of the baseline for when you take damage from your cursed weakness, again, this should be pretty common, but this is a 2-action activity, and the effect is, you have grown accustomed to the curse that comes with your blessing, able to channel its effect through your attacks and forestall your own demise. Make a melee strike. On a success, the target takes an additional 1d10 void damage, and your doomed value is reduced by 1. Okay, so this is where Warrior of Legend starts to get interesting for me, because the risk versus reward is really interesting here. If you are doomed 2, so if you took damage from your cursed weakness, you can, as a 2-action activity, make a melee strike that deals an additional 1d10 void damage, and if you hit, you also lower your doomed value. This is solid. This kind of sits in the same place as whatever the new power attack feat is, Furious Strike or something like that. I don't remember the exact name. This kind of sits in the same place as the new power attack, but you're dealing void damage. That's an interesting little niche to this. And because you are doomed 2 when you're using this ability, theoretically you are fighting against an opponent who is using your cursed weakness. So even though your doomed condition is going up and down, essentially by targeting your weakness, your opponent is inflicting additional damage on themselves every time you hit them back. Again, I don't know if this is balanced perfectly, but it is interesting. I absolutely think this is an interesting choice, and I think if you're playing a Warrior of Legend, I think 8th level when Piercing Doom comes online, I think that's the point where this class archetype certainly gets entertaining. I don't know how it's actually going to play out, But I love this feat. I love getting to add void damage to your attacks. And I really love the fact that we're getting to see some of this narrative tug between risk and reward coming into play. So at the very least, I think this is interesting. Moving on, we have the level 10 feat, Spear of Doom. This is a one-action activity, and it has the requirement: an enemy hit you with an attack dealing the same type of damage as your cursed weakness within the last round, and you are doomed 1 or greater. So Piercing Doom, the previous feat, you have to be at least doomed 2, but even if you use Piercing Doom and lower your doomed value, Spear of Doom can still be online. Let's go ahead and read it. The conditions for your doom have been met, and you brace yourself for a battle that will see you either live to fight another day or die a legend. You enter the Spear of Doom stance. Oh, this is a stance feat. I completely missed that a second ago. So this is a stance feat that has a requirement to enter the stance. Okay, sorry I missed that a second ago. You enter the Spear of Doom stance. While in this stance, as long as the enemy who triggered your curse weakness is within your reach, you can strike them as a reaction whenever they succeed or critically succeed at an attack against you. You gain an additional reaction immediately, and at the start of each of your subsequent turns, that can only be used to make a reactive strike against an opponent or to make the strike granted by this stance. While in the Spear of Doom stance, your cursed weakness is equal to your level instead of half your level. Oh, this is spicy. I'm gonna be honest, I skipped this feat when I was planning for this video, so this one's kind of catching me off guard a little bit, but this is spicy. I like it. This is a unique stance for the Warrior of Legend. You can enter it as long as you're doomed 1 or greater, and so presumably you have to remain doomed to stay in this stance, but anytime someone hits you, you get a special reactive strike where you get to hit them back, and you get a bonus reaction, meaning that as a 10th level Warrior of Legend, you effectively have 2 reactive strikes a turn. That is... I mean, the downside is obvious here. Your cursed weakness is worse. While you are in this stance, you are going to take a lot of extra damage, but 2 reactive strikes. One of them has to be against a specific enemy, but oh my goodness, that is a very powerful stance. I honestly can't believe I overlooked this feat when I was pre-reading this before I started recording this video. I missed a spicy one. So again, I love this feat. I haven't seen this at my table. I don't know if this balances out perfectly, but I really enjoy the idea of having multiple reactive strikes, and pole arms, you're probably going to have pretty good reach, so reactive strike is better when you have extra reach. So I'm going to be honest, I like the Spear of Doom stance. I think this feat is very good. The increased curse weakness has me nervous, but this one's fun. I like this one. Spear of Doom, I'm pretty sold on this feat. So the low levels on Warrior of Legend Class Archetype were pretty rough, but we're getting into some good content now. Let's move on to our next reaction, the 12th level feat, Know Thy Doom. Again, this is a reaction. It's usable once per day. It has the Fortune trait, and it has the trigger: you are doomed 1 or greater, and your dying value would increase. It reads, as your legend grows, details of your demise become clearer, and you know that it is not yet your time. You can attempt a recovery check using your dying value before it increases, rolling twice and taking the better result. Regardless of the outcome, reduce your doomed value by 1. Okay, so this is a pretty solid reaction, and it's a reaction that you specifically use when you would be dying, so it's not going to interfere with anything else you would do. And when you use this reaction, it's going to lower your doomed value by 1. That is going to happen no matter what you roll. That is very positive and increases the survivability of your character, offsetting the disadvantage from your archetype. That's very solid, but it just kind of counterbalances what you were already dealing with. So the real benefit here is it is a reaction when you are dying that effectively lets you roll your recovery check twice, taking the better result. This again is pretty solid. I don't think this is going to sell anyone on the Warrior of Legend archetype, but I think it's a pretty nice ability, and it adds some good survivability to a archetype that needed some survivability, so I'm okay with this feat. It's not as spicy as the last two options, but I don't have a problem with it. I think it's pretty good. Next up, Feat 14, we have Only My Doom May Claim Me. The power of your legend, fueled by your legendary deeds, resists any weapon that is not tied to your curse. You gain resistance equal to half your level against weapon and unarmed attacks that deal a damage type other than the type chosen for your cursed weakness. Okay, so I like this one. Again, I don't think it's as spicy as your level 8 and level 10 picks, but this one is pretty solid. If you take your 3 damage options, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, you are weaker to 1, but now you are resistant to the other 2, and I actually think that's pretty solid in favor of most characters. You essentially have 2 and 3 odds that any physical damage you encounter is going to be resisted, with only that 1 in 3 that you've had to deal with before dealing extra damage to you. Now, we are at level 14 now, so energy damage is a lot more common, so I think the overall how often physical damage type comes in, that's going down. So I don't think that Only My Doom May Claim Me is necessarily super powerful, but I do think it's solid, so I think this one is okay. And then our last class archetype specific feat is Razor's Edge at 18, and this one says, your curse and your power are one and the same, and you accept both equally. You can enter the Spear of Doom stance as a free action. Oh, prerequisite Spear of Doom. So this takes the Spear of Doom stance, which I absolutely love, and makes it a free action to enter. Yeah, this is a good one. Again, not super powerful, but it's better action economy, so overall I can't complain about this one. Alright, looking specifically at the Warrior of Legend class archetype feats, I think that this is a class archetype where the good stuff is kind of right in the middle of your character development. The low-level stuff, level 1, is pretty rough. Level 2 makes up a little bit of the ground, but you're still hurting a bit. Level 4 is solid, it makes up for shield block pretty well. I really think Piercing Doom and Spear of Doom, I think those two feats are the core of what is appealing about this class archetype. If you like the risk versus reward of Piercing Doom and Spear of Doom, I think this class archetype can appeal to you. I think both of those are very spicy, very interesting. I like them a lot. After those two, the feats are okay, but they're not like speaking to me on a deep level. They're just okay. They're things I'd like to have. But all of this leads to the question, do I think that the Warrior of Legend class archetype is worth all of the downsides that come with the class archetype? And I think I can say, if you know you're getting to the mid-tier of play with the character, I think it's okay. Piercing Doom and Spear of Doom, I really like those two abilities, and I think they would be a lot of fun to use, and then there's some other decent stuff sprinkled around this. So I think if I knew for sure that a game that I was joining was going to feature level 8 to 10 play, and I knew that my character was going to get there, I think I would be willing to give Warrior of Legend a shot, because these abilities are pretty fun, and there's some other interesting stuff that you can dive into around that. None of the other stuff is really just pulling me into this class archetype, but those two options, those are both very interesting on a narrative and mechanical level, so those two, if I could get them, I think would be worth trying out. Now, before we leave Warrior of Legend, I do want to point out really quick that there are a couple of additional fighter feats that are presented alongside the Warrior of Legend, but these are not specific to the Warrior of Legend. These are fighter feats that any fighter can potentially take. Obviously, both of these feats fit well with the Warrior of Legend, but other fighters can have them. The first one is Spear Dancer. This is a single action activity. The requirement is that you're wielding a weapon from the Spear or Polearm group, and it says, you favor weapons that allow you to lash out viciously while keeping enemies at bay, giving you an opportunity to strike without fear of reprisal. You step and then strike with a spear or polearm you're wielding, or strike with the spear or polearm, then step. This is pretty decent action economy. It's going to allow you to get a little bit of movement, get a strike in. Kind of fits with other abilities we see fighters get. pretty solid, and obviously works well with the intended weapons that a Warrior of Legend is designed to use. The higher level option, available at 16, is Needle in the God's Eyes. This is a 2-action activity. With sinews of brawn and thews of iron, you leap to the heavens, piercing the arrogant eyes of the gods. Okay, I don't even know what this feat does, and I just love that sentence. Leap up to your total speed, either horizontally and vertically, and strike twice at any point or points during the leap. Each attack counts towards your multiple attack penalty, but don't increase your penalty until you have made both attacks. Okay, alright. This is a little bit situational, but it is pretty useful. It's a movement ability, so you get to leap up to your speed up. You can leap horizontal, you can leap vertical. That certainly is going to have its uses. And you get to make 2 strikes during the movement. It can be at any point, and those 2 strikes don't have to be at the same point. And those strikes don't have a multiple attack penalty, though they do count towards it after they're over. So if the Piercing Doom feat at level 8 is kind of your upgraded power attack equivalent, Needle in the God's Eyes is kind of your upgraded, like, spring attack, I think is what this is intended to be. So I think this one's pretty solid as well. I do want to complain a little bit that if you're going to call it Needle in the God's Eyes, I would like this to have a chance of maybe temporarily blinding someone, maybe if you score a critical hit or something. I wish there was some kind of condition tacked onto Needle in the God's Eyes, but otherwise I like this one. And again, this is available to all fighters, so I think it's pretty solid. But all in all, that is the Warrior of Legend class archetype that is presented in War of Immortals. It is a pretty heavy ask at first level, and I do think it takes a while for this class archetype to get online, but once this class archetype is online, I do think it has some pretty interesting options, especially Piercing Doom and Spear of Doom. Both of those are pretty fun. So my ultimate takeaway from the Warrior of Legend class archetype, I think that I am happy that Paizo added this to the game. I can see why a lot of people would be hesitant about using this class archetype. If the narrative that Paizo is going for is not for you, I totally understand. I could see why this class archetype wouldn't fit a lot of tables, and if that kind of story is not the story you're going for, I would pass this over. It's definitely not going to be a sell. However, if the narrative is something that does appeal to you, and you like the risk versus reward that Paizo is playing with, where your character has the doomed condition but can also use the doomed condition to gain some advantages, if that style of play, if those mechanics intrigue you, I think when you get up to level 8 and from that point on, I think this could be a lot of fun. So at the end of the day, I am happy that Paizo put this into the game. I do think that it would have been a good idea for Paizo to offer maybe just a little bit more at lower levels so that it doesn't feel so bad compared to just a normal fighter when you're playing the low-level version of this. But again, I don't think the penalties are so bad to make it just completely unplayable. So even at low-level play, I still think that the Warrior of Legend is something that could be brought to a table and still be used effectively. I don't think the low-level version of this class archetype is so bad that it just precludes you from using this character. But the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about the Warrior of Legend class archetype, and do you think that Paizo struck the right balance narratively and mechanically bringing this style of character into the game? Do you think the Warrior of Legend is effective? Or do you think that the mechanical hindrances to this class archetype are just too big of a problem to overcome, meaning that ultimately this is a class archetype that you would never use? Jump down to the comments section and let me know what you think of the Warrior of Legend. And while you're doing that, please remember to do all the other stuff that helps to support this channel. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can check out my free Discord, my Patreon. All of those links will be in the video description below. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.